What comes to mind when you hear the word crusader? For many people, the image is immediate. A knight wearing a white tunic marked with a red cross, marching eastward under a religious banner, sword in hand, determined to conquer foreign lands in the name of God. In movies, television shows, and countless online discussions, crusaders are often portrayed as medieval fanatics, violent religious extremists driven by hatred and intolerance. According to this version of history, the Crusades were little more than a series of unprovoked invasions carried out by Christians against a peaceful Muslim world.
Popular culture frequently reinforces this image. In films such as Kingdom of Heaven, some crusader figures, particularly militant nobles and members of military orders, are portrayed as ruthless, fanatical, and corrupted by religious zeal, while leaders like Saladin are often depicted as more measured and diplomatic. Even comedic works such as Monty Python and the Holy Grail exaggerate medieval Christianity into absurdity, helping cement a broader association between religion and irrational violence. Historical dramas and documentaries often focus on corruption, greed, and religious extremism, while many online discussions, social media posts, and short educational videos reduce the conflict to a simple story of aggressors and victims. As a result, crusaders are often remembered less as complex historical figures and more as symbols of religious violence.
On the other side of the debate, some people tell a very different story. To them, the Crusaders were heroes, defenders of Christendom, men who stood between Europe and destruction, noble warriors who sacrificed everything to protect their faith, their civilization, and the holy places of Christianity. So, which version is true? Were the Crusaders villains? Were they heroes? Or is the real story far more complicated than either side wants to admit? The Crusades are among the most debated events in world history. More than 900 years after the first crusading armies marched toward Jerusalem, people are still arguing about what they meant, why they happened, and whether they were justified.
Part of the problem is that most people never encounter the Crusades through historical sources. Instead, they encounter them through modern politics, internet arguments, movies, social media posts, and simplified classroom lessons. In many schools, the Crusades are often summarized in a few short sentences. European Christians invaded the Middle East, committed atrocities, and failed to achieve their goals. While there is truth in that statement, it leaves out a tremendous amount of context. History is rarely that simple. Imagine trying to explain the Second World War in a single sentence. Technically, you could do it, but you would miss nearly everything that made the conflict understandable. The same is true for the Crusades. To understand why tens of thousands of men left their homes and traveled thousands of miles toward lands they had never seen, we must first understand the world they lived in. We have to step into the mindset of the 11th century. This was a world very different from our own. People did not think like modern people. Religion was not merely a private belief. It shaped politics, culture, law, identity, and everyday life. Most people genuinely believed that heaven and hell were real places. They believed that eternal salvation mattered more than wealth, comfort, or even life itself. For medieval Christians, Jerusalem was not simply another city on a map. It was the city where Jesus had preached, died, and risen from the dead. It was the spiritual center of their world. Today, traveling to Jerusalem might require a passport and a plane ticket. In the Middle Ages, it could require months of dangerous travel across continents. Yet countless pilgrims made the journey anyway. Why? Because they believed it brought them closer to God.
The First Crusade began in 1096, but to understand why it happened at all, we have to go much further back in time.
In fact, the road to Jerusalem did not begin in 1095. It began centuries earlier, shaped by religious change, political collapse, and shifting empires across the Mediterranean world. When Christianity first emerged, its most important centers were not in Western Europe, as many people assume today. They were in the Middle East and North Africa. Jerusalem was the city where Jesus was crucified and believed to have resurrected. Antioch was where followers of Jesus were first called Christians, according to Acts 11:26. Alexandria in Egypt became one of the most influential centers of Christian learning in the early centuries of the church. For a long period, these regions formed the heart of the Christian world under the Roman and later Byzantine empires. That world began to change dramatically in the 7th century with the rise of Islam in Arabia. Following the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, Muslim Arab armies expanded rapidly across the Middle East and North Africa. Within a relatively short historical period, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and large parts of North Africa came under Muslim rule. Historical sources, such as Hugh Kennedy's The Great Arab Conquests, describe this as one of the most rapid and transformative expansions in world history.
Importantly, this did not mean the disappearance of Christianity in those regions. Christian communities continued to exist for centuries under Muslim governance. Churches remained active, and Christian pilgrims were often still allowed access to holy sites in Jerusalem, although conditions varied over time depending on rulers and political stability. What changed was not the existence of Christianity, but the political control of territories that had once been ruled by Christian empires. For centuries, this situation remained relatively stable, but by the 11th century, new pressures emerged. A major turning point came with the rise of the Seljuk Turks, a Turkic people who had converted to Islam and expanded rapidly across Persia, modern-day Iran, Syria, and Anatolia, part of modern-day Turkey. Unlike earlier Arab caliphates, the Seljuks were more militarized and expansion-driven, and their arrival introduced new instability into the region. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, was entering a period of crisis. For centuries, Byzantium had acted as a buffer between Europe and the Eastern powers, with Constantinople standing as one of the richest and most powerful cities in the medieval world. But that power was weakening. The decisive moment came in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert, where the Byzantine army suffered a major defeat against the Seljuk Turks. As recorded in Byzantine and later historical sources, this loss had far-reaching consequences. Large parts of Anatolia, which had been the empire's core recruitment base and economic backbone, began slipping out of Byzantine control. Without Anatolia, Byzantium lost much of its military and financial stability. Facing this crisis, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sought help from Western Europe. His request was not originally for a holy war. It was a military appeal for trained soldiers to help reclaim lost Byzantine territory and stabilize the eastern frontier. What followed, however, would take a very different direction. In 1095, Pope Urban II convened the Council of Clermont in France. At the time, the Pope was not just a religious leader, but the highest authority of the Western Church, which shaped law, education, and political legitimacy across medieval Europe. As Bishop of Rome and head of the Latin Christian world, Urban had the power to excommunicate rulers, influence kings, and call major church councils that brought nobles and clergy together across different regions. In a period where religion defined public life, this authority gave his words enormous weight.
At Clermont, he delivered a speech that would become one of the most significant moments in medieval history. According to chroniclers such as Fulcher of Chartres and Robert the Monk, Urban spoke about the suffering of Eastern Christians, the need to assist the Byzantine Empire, and the importance of Jerusalem as a sacred city in Christian belief. He called on Western Christians, especially knights who had been engaged in constant internal warfare, to redirect their violence toward what he described as a righteous cause. His message spread rapidly across Europe. The phrase Deus vult, God wills it, became a rallying cry, symbolizing both religious devotion and military purpose.
But the Crusades did not emerge from a single cause. They were the result of multiple overlapping forces: Byzantine political pressure, Seljuk expansion, centuries of shifting control over former Christian territories, and a Western church that saw an opportunity to unify Christendom under a shared mission. At the same time, this mission carried a deeper religious dimension, because it briefly represented an attempt to bring together the two major branches of Christianity at the time: the Western Latin Church, centered in Rome, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, centered in Constantinople, which was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, under a common cause, even though they remained distinct and politically separate.
By the time the call reached the public, it resonated deeply in a society where religion shaped nearly every aspect of life. For many, participation was not just military service, it was pilgrimage, penance, and spiritual duty combined. Within months, thousands began preparing for a journey across Europe toward Constantinople and beyond. The First Crusade had begun. What followed was not one single army moving together, but many different groups of crusaders traveling separately across Europe toward Constantinople. These forces were led by powerful nobles, each with their own soldiers and goals. When they arrived, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos allowed them to cross into Anatolia, but only after they agreed to return any former Byzantine lands they captured. This agreement later caused tension between the Crusaders and the Byzantines. Once in Anatolia, the Crusaders immediately faced serious resistance from the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks avoided large battles and instead attacked quickly, using fast cavalry to disrupt supplies and weaken smaller Crusader groups. Even with these difficulties, the Crusaders managed an important early victory at the Siege of Nicaea in 1097, which was handed over to the Byzantines. Soon after, they won a tough battle at Dorylaeum, where leaders like Bohemond of Taranto and Raymond of Toulouse helped their forces survive a sudden Seljuk attack and eventually push them back. As they moved deeper into the region, the Crusaders began to act more independently. Baldwin of Boulogne left the main army and took control of the city of Edessa in 1098 after getting involved in a local conflict.
This became the first Crusader state. Meanwhile, the main army faced one of its hardest challenges at Antioch. The city was strongly defended, and the siege lasted for months. The Crusaders suffered from hunger and disease, but they eventually took the city after someone inside betrayed it. Bohemond of Taranto then claimed it for himself, creating another Crusader state. After Antioch, the remaining forces continued toward Jerusalem. The journey was long and difficult, with limited food and supplies. When they finally reached the city in 1099, it was under Muslim control from Egypt. After a short siege, the Crusaders broke through the walls and captured Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon became a key leader and chose not to call himself king, but instead took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, showing the religious importance of the city to the Crusaders. Together with Edessa, Antioch, and later Tripoli, these conquests formed the Crusader states, marking the First Crusade as a rare and unexpected success in medieval history. The First Crusade had achieved what many in Europe thought impossible. Territories gained include Jerusalem in Israel, Antioch, modern-day Antakya, Turkey, Edessa, modern-day Şanlıurfa, Turkey, and Tripoli in Lebanon.
The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, the first major failure. The immediate trigger for the Second Crusade was the fall of Edessa in 1144. Edessa had been the first of the Crusader states established after the First Crusade, positioned in a vulnerable frontier zone between Latin Christian territories and surrounding Muslim polities. Its loss to Imad al-Din Zengi, the ruler of Mosul and Aleppo, shocked Western Christendom. Contemporary Latin sources describe it as a moment of crisis, and it quickly prompted a renewed call to arms. Pope Eugene III issued a formal appeal for a new crusade, which was later reinforced by the preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the time. His sermons helped mobilize large sections of European nobility and common people alike, framing the campaign as both a spiritual duty and a defensive necessity. Two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe answered the call:
King Louis VII of France, and Emperor Conrad III of Germany. On paper, this should have been a decisive force. In reality, it became a case study in how fragile coordination could undermine even the largest armies of the medieval world.
From the beginning, the campaign suffered from lack of unity. German forces moved through Anatolia ahead of the French and were heavily weakened by Seljuk Turkish tactics, particularly fast-moving cavalry raids that avoided direct confrontation while cutting off supply lines. These were tactics that had already proven effective against earlier Crusader forces and would continue to shape the conflict in the region. By the time the remaining armies reached the Levant, their strength and cohesion had already deteriorated significantly. Strategic disagreements soon followed. Instead of prioritizing Edessa, the original objective, the Crusader leadership turned toward Damascus. At the time, Damascus occupied a complex political position and was not the central power behind Edessa's fall, but it was seen by Crusader leaders as a valuable strategic prize that could strengthen their position in the region. The Siege of Damascus in 1148 became one of the most controversial episodes in Crusader history. Accounts from both Latin and Arabic chroniclers agree on its short duration and abrupt failure. Internal disagreements between Crusader factions, combined with strong resistance from the city and shifting local alliances, caused the siege to collapse within days. The Crusaders withdrew without achieving their objective. No major territory was recovered. Edessa remained lost, and the campaign ended in failure. For Western Europe, the impact was profound. Unlike the First Crusade, which had ended in overwhelming success, the Second Crusade returned with no meaningful gains. It marked the first time a large-scale crusading expedition had failed outright, forcing a reassessment of expectations. The assumption that divine favor would automatically translate into military success was no longer sustainable. In the Near East, meanwhile, the political landscape continued to evolve. Out of this shifting environment would rise one of the most significant figures of the entire crusading era, Saladin.
The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Richard versus Saladin. The Third Crusade did not begin in the way modern wars are often described, with a single clear aggressor. Instead, it was the result of a chain of events that made large-scale conflict almost unavoidable. By the late 12th century, the political situation in the Near East had shifted significantly. The previously divided Muslim territories had been largely unified under Saladin, the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, who brought Egypt, Syria, and surrounding regions under a single coordinated leadership through both military strength and diplomacy. This new unity changed the balance of power. In 1187, Saladin launched a major military campaign against the Crusader states in the Levant. This led to the decisive Battle of Hattin, where the Crusader army suffered a devastating defeat, losing much of its military strength and symbolic relics, such as the True Cross, according to contemporary accounts. Following this collapse, Jerusalem, held by the Crusaders since 1099, fell to Saladin's forces. It was this sequence of events, especially the loss of Jerusalem, that triggered the call for the Third Crusade across Europe. The loss of Jerusalem was not just a territorial setback, it was a profound religious and symbolic crisis. It led directly to the launch of the Third Crusade, sometimes called the King's Crusade because of the high-profile rulers involved.
3 major monarchs took the cross: Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. For the first time, some of the most powerful figures in Western Europe were personally involved in a crusade. However, the campaign immediately faced structural challenges. Frederick Barbarossa drowned during the journey to the Holy Land, removing a major portion of the German force before it even arrived. Philip II contributed to early operations, but eventually returned to France. This left Richard I as the primary leader of the Crusader effort. Richard's military campaigns along the eastern Mediterranean coast were among the most effective of the crusading period. his forces captured Acre after a prolonged siege, securing an important logistical base. Several other coastal cities also came under Crusader control, stabilizing parts of the region and restoring a limited Latin presence. But despite these successes, the central objective remained out of reach. Jerusalem itself could not be taken. The Crusader forces lacked the manpower to sustain a prolonged siege of such a heavily fortified and strategically positioned city, especially given Saladin's continued control of the interior regions. At the same time, both sides were becoming increasingly exhausted after years of conflict.
Eventually, a negotiated settlement was reached. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while leaving the city under Muslim control. It was a compromise rather than a victory. Richard retained coastal territories that ensured a continued Crusader presence in the Levant, but Jerusalem remained outside their control. Saladin, for his part, maintained political authority over the city while granting limited religious access. Shortly after these events, Richard returned to Europe, and Saladin died in 1193. Both figures left behind enduring reputations shaped by later historical memory, often idealized in different traditions. Yet for the crusading movement as a whole, the implications were clear. The era of straightforward military success was over. The Third Crusade demonstrated both the potential and the limits of Western intervention in the region. Victory was no longer guaranteed, and even the most powerful monarchs in Europe could not simply repeat the outcome of 1099. The Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, Crusaders attacked Christians. The Fourth Crusade was originally intended to strike directly at Muslim-controlled Jerusalem. However, logistical constraints quickly altered its trajectory. The Crusaders lacked the funds to pay Venice for transport across the Mediterranean, and this financial dependency became a turning point. Venice, a powerful maritime republic with its own strategic interests, negotiated an alternative arrangement. Instead of immediate payment, the Crusaders would assist Venice in military operations aligned with Venetian goals. At the same time, internal Byzantine political struggles introduced a new complication. A claimant to the Byzantine throne, Alexios IV Angelos, promised financial and military support to the Crusaders if they helped restore him to power in Constantinople. This convergence of financial pressure, political opportunity, and strategic negotiation redirected the crusade entirely. In 1203, Crusader forces arrived at Constantinople and helped install Alexios IV. However, his position quickly destabilized, and by 1204, the situation escalated into open conflict. The Crusaders attacked the city itself. The sack of Constantinople that followed was devastating. Contemporary accounts describe widespread looting, destruction of religious sites, and the transfer of numerous relics to Western Europe. It was one of the most severe shocks in medieval Christian history.
The significance of this event cannot be overstated. For the first time, a crusading army had turned against a major Christian city. The relationship between the Latin West and the Byzantine East was deeply damaged, creating a division that would persist for centuries. The Fourth Crusade therefore stands as a turning point, marking the moment when political and economic realities overtook the original religious objective. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, Egypt as the new target. In the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, attention returned to the Holy Land. However, strategic thinking had shifted. Instead of attacking Jerusalem directly, Crusader planners focused on Egypt, which was seen as the economic and military core of Muslim power in the region. The campaign targeted the city of Damietta in the Nile Delta. After a prolonged siege, Crusader forces succeeded in capturing it in 1219. At that moment, the campaign appeared promising. However, further advance into Egypt proved far more difficult. The Crusaders underestimated environmental conditions, logistical challenges, and the strength of organized resistance.
When they attempted to push toward Cairo, their forces became overextended and vulnerable. By 1221, the Crusader army was forced into negotiation. Damietta was returned in exchange for safe withdrawal. The expedition ended in failure, reinforcing the growing reality that territorial gains were increasingly difficult to sustain.
The Sixth Crusade, led by Emperor Frederick II, differed significantly from earlier campaigns. Frederick had been excommunicated by the Pope, yet he proceeded to the Holy Land regardless. Instead of relying on large-scale military operations, he pursued diplomatic negotiation. The Muslim world at the time was also divided by internal rivalries, creating an opening for political settlement. In 1229, Frederick negotiated a treaty with Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt. Under the agreement, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth were transferred to Crusader control, although key religious sites within Jerusalem remained under Muslim authority. No major battles were fought. The transfer was achieved through diplomacy rather than conquest. However, the arrangement was politically fragile and lacked broad legitimacy. Frederick's position was contested by both religious authorities and local powers. Nevertheless, it remains one of the most unusual outcomes in Crusader history, a temporary return of Jerusalem without warfare.
The Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1254, the final major royal campaign. By the mid-13th century, the Crusader states were increasingly vulnerable. Muslim powers had consolidated under stronger and more centralized leadership structures, making coordinated resistance more effective. In this context, King Louis IX of France launched the Seventh Crusade, again focusing on Egypt as the strategic key to Jerusalem. In 1249, Crusader forces captured Damietta, repeating the earlier success of the Fifth Crusade. However, the advance inland quickly encountered the same structural problems: disease, supply breakdown, and strong resistance. At the Battle of Mansoura, Crusader forces suffered heavy losses, and Louis IX himself was captured. His eventual release required ransom and withdrawal. The campaign ended in complete failure, marking one of the most dramatic reversals in crusading history. By this stage, it was clear that even major European monarchs could not overcome the transformed political and military realities of the Near East.
The Eighth Crusade and the end of the crusading dream. The Eighth Crusade marked one of the final attempts to revive large-scale crusading efforts in the Holy Land, but unlike the earlier expeditions, it ended almost as soon as it began. It was led by King Louis IX of France, who had already taken part in the Seventh Crusade decades earlier and remained deeply committed to the idea of religious warfare as a form of devotion and duty. However, unlike his previous campaign in Egypt, where he had captured Damietta before suffering a major defeat at Mansoura, being taken prisoner and later released after ransom, the Eighth Crusade unfolded in a very different way. This time, the expedition was redirected toward North Africa, modern-day Tunisia, rather than the Holy Land, and it never achieved any major military success or decisive engagement. Instead of achieving territorial gains or strategic victories, the campaign quickly collapsed due to disease, harsh environmental conditions, and political instability within the region. Louis IX himself died during the expedition in 1270, most likely from illness, bringing the crusade to an abrupt and symbolic end. His death represented more than the loss of a leader. It marked the fading of an era in which European monarchs could still attempt large, coordinated military campaigns in the Eastern Mediterranean with any realistic expectation of success. After this point, crusading activity became increasingly limited, fragmented, and politically driven, rather than large-scale religious warfare. Over time, many misconceptions have developed about the Crusaders. One common belief is that all Crusaders were bloodthirsty fanatics, but historical evidence shows a far more complex reality. Many participants were devout pilgrims motivated by sincere religious belief, while others were driven by hopes of land, status, or personal advancement.
Another misconception is that the Crusades were completely unprovoked, when in reality, they were influenced by multiple overlapping factors, including Byzantine appeals for military assistance, the expansion of Seljuk power, and concerns over the safety of Christian pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem. At the same time, it is also inaccurate to portray the Crusaders as saints. Historical records from both Christian and Muslim sources describe episodes of violence, political rivalry, and internal conflict, including massacres during key sieges and disputes between rival leaders. In truth, the Crusaders were neither pure heroes nor pure villains. They were products of a violent and deeply religious age, acting within the beliefs, limitations, and pressures of their time. The Crusaders were neither saints nor monsters. They were products of a violent age, fighting for causes they believed were eternal.
If you enjoy this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this.